a joint venture with Hong Kong Institute of University of Science and Technology. We'll talk a little more about that, but let me now introduce Albert Park. He will say a couple of words then, and then we'll move forward. He's the director of Institute, professor of course in UST, and the director of Institute for Merger and Market Studies.
Right, so Shlomo and I have been organizing this kind of very short workshop really as an opportunity for the faculty at HKUST Business School and the faculty here at New Economics School to get to know each other better. Many of you may have heard that HKUST is now working very closely with Skolkovo, Moscow School of Management, on a joint EMBA program, but a broader kind of collaboration to try to really support Skolkovo's ambitions to really raise the caliber of their business programs to kind of the international level. And so we have a very large group coming from UST, and I'm very grateful that many of our colleagues, who, even those not presenting or not in economics or finance, are here. And let me just introduce briefly. We brought our heavy hitters, really, in many respects. So Jata Lee is the head of our management department.
Former head, right?
Former head, and former associate dean. And Chu Zhang is the current head of the finance department. Acting. I obviously like to oversell my colleagues. I direct the Institute for Emerging Market Studies, which is an institute at the university. And we also have Yan Xu, who directs our executive MBA program at UST, and Chris Tsang, who is also executive director at the business school, and Steve and Emily Nason. Steve's in our management department, and Emily's one of our associate deans at the business school. And Danyang Xia, I don't want to forget him, he's an economist, a macroeconomist, former head, not current, of our economics department.
Former dean.
And former dean, sorry. Now I'm underselling. And so we're very aware of the very high academic reputation of New Economics School. So since we're going to be coming and working in Skolkovo Hub, hopefully we'll have a kind of a more consistent presence here. We'd like to really develop closer ties to the faculty at New Economics School, who in many ways we have a very natural affinity to, because very academically oriented, cover a broad range of disciplines and sub-disciplines. So today, unfortunately, because of time constraints, all the presentations are very brief. So we're asking the speakers to finish within 25 minutes, including questions, so we can have time for a short break in the middle, and try to finish by about 5 p.m. So, right, okay, or so. So that's it, thanks.
No, just another thing, just for the other side, to introduce the new economic faculty: Andrei Markevich, Dimas Atanasiou, Anya Apizhaeva, Olga Kuzmina, Pavle Radichevich, and myself. That's what we have, an instrument of our communication officer.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Very pleased to be here. I apologize for being late. We had an academic council meeting during the lunch. I want to make 2 comments before I start. First of all, I'm a management professor, right? I know this is a little bit different audience, economists, finance professors. So if what I'm talking about is little bit different from what you have in mind, feel free to take a nap, right? And probably very good, because this is just after the big lunch we had. Right? So, okay, so I'm just getting started. So what I'm going to talk about is I will talk about the innovation of Chinese companies. Okay, which is learning from exporting and the rule of institutions, right? The rule of institutions. I'll give a short version of executive version in the other day in the primary, but today I will focus more for academic side, right? So I will start by giving you a very brief overview of some of the current thinking research in an area which I do a lot of my work called global strategy research. So what's happening now with emerging markets, with China, with global strategy research, for example, there are several areas, which I just list them here, which are what we call now, is getting a lot of attention, traction, right? So one is we're talking about the multinational, new multinational companies from emerging markets, for example, from Russia, from China, and they all toward foreign direct investment, right, FDI. Some of them involve mergers acquisitions, right? So this is one area which getting a lot of attention. The second area which getting a lot of attention is what we call the informal institutions and global business. In fact, I will be an editor of this special issue for a leading journal called Journal of International Business Studies. I will spend just 1 minute to talk a little bit about what are the informal institutions for that link to global international business. The third area which is getting a lot of attention is the digital economy, right? Global business and digital economy. In fact, this actually was the Open Innovation Forum, the thing that we had last 2 days, right? And this actually is, I will be a program chair for a major conference next year in Minnesota, which is actually on the theme of global business and digital economy. Another area which is getting a lot of attention, obviously we're talking about the Belt and Road Initiative now. And also in the US, for example, there are a lot of discussion about global regional integration and disintegration, right? With President Trump, now the NAFTA is now being renegotiated, right? So there's actually a lot of discussion about the regional integration and going from disintegration. The last one, which is actually the topic of my discussion today, is what we're talking about innovation, especially the indigenous innovation from local companies, and that actually is one area which again a lot of attention. So feel free to stop me anytime, ask me any questions you want to ask. So but let me just walk through a little bit of the things I'm doing right now before I get to talk about the research, right? One of the things I'm doing right now is I'm an editor of this journal called Journal of International Business Studies. So one thing we do is I'm actually a guest editor for a special issue. This special issue is on the informal institutions and global business. In fact, the special issue has just been approved. We have not made a public announcement yet. So you are actually the first mover, right? First group of people who hear about this special issue. And if you are doing some research on informal institutions and global business, this is definitely something we want to think about, right? So we have some columns here, right? So what this special issue we're looking at is also looking not only the difference of informal institutions, where institutions are the rule of the game of society, right? Formal institutions are the written rules, regulations, laws, so on and so forth. Informal institutions, for example, in China, we talk about guanxi relationships. These are informal institutions. We talk about political connections. These are informal institutions. Okay? So there's this special issue in this journal, which I'm involved as one of the guest editor, and we want to, if you are interested, right? That's another time. Sometime next year, since we have not formally announced the special issue yet. This is what I just talked about. The literature has been looking at the importance of institutions, which is actually the topic I will talk about today. Okay? However, most of the literature has focused on what we call the formal institutions, right? Some things written, formal rules, regulations. This is unfortunate because formal institutions only provide a part of the picture, right? According to W.S. North, right, economist, right? So in fact, in emerging markets, for example, China, Russia, Brazil, right, BRICS countries, they are what we call institutional voids, the gaps in institutions. Right? Institutions are not well developed, right? So the gaps there, and in this market, the informal institutions, for example, in China, the guanxi connections, that actually become critical. Okay? So in fact, this is what Taiwan Kana at Harvard Business School, he wrote a book on informal institution voice. So this is actually one area we're looking for more research. Okay? So one area, if you are interested in, and we have a special issue. Now, since I'm an editor of this journal called Journal of International Business Studies, I just want to give you a picture here to see this is actually an interdisciplinary journal. So in a sense, we have people in strategy, cross-cultural management, so on and so forth, but we also welcome people in economics, accounting, finance, and so forth. Okay? So some of you are insist, especially look at international issues, we definitely welcome your work here. Okay, so this one commercial is done about the special issue, the journal. Another commercial which I'm doing is the conference which I'm the program chair. So just I only have one slide for you, right? So this will be in Minneapolis. We have quite a few people from Minnesota, and this there will be next year. The theme actually going to be global business and digital economy. And if you want to send in a paper, the deadline is November 20th. This is all on the website of this AIB. Then you'll feel this one. Okay. Now I'm not going to talk about the conference. So let me then focus on the work that talk about the innovation of Chinese companies and the role of institutional development. This actually, a paper just last month accepted at this journal, Studies. So this just been accepted. We apologize if you cannot see clearly. So we were talking about, for this project, we actually have two studies. So I will just present very quickly what are some of the ideas that we look at. The first study, so in this paper we have two studies. Now it's very difficult to publish paper, so you have multiple studies, right? So the first study, we look at learning by export. So companies export to other countries, and they learn from that process. And we look at how effective can companies learn from exporting, and what is the rule, or what is the role of the institutions? Okay. The institution development, how that facility the firms to learn from the exporting activity. So this obviously is a subject a lot of economists have looked at, right? Trade economists look at firms learning by exporting, because exporters have been found to be more innovative. They know exporters because they have they by exporting they involved with have access to overseas knowledge, right? Different type of knowledge, right? And the literature also look at what are the other firm level factors which can facilitating this learning from exporting, right? For example, when creating a firm's own technology capabilities. So what we call in strategy, we call them as assorted capacity. So firm's ability to learn, right, from the exporting. Now, what we observe is that in the literature actually, there is not enough attention to look at what are the external environment, for example, institutions, how institutions, the macro level factor, which affects these learning processes. So the model we are looking at is we look at the companies exporting, right, their products abroad. By exporting, they have access to overseas knowledge. We want to look at how they have access to overseas knowledge translate into their innovative capabilities, their innovation. Okay? And the factor we are looking at is actually what we call the moderating effects of this institution. So this is our first study. What is the role of home country institutions play in influence their firm's ability to learn by exporting innovation and new products? So this is the research question for our first study. Okay, now how do we define innovation? Right? We actually take this perspective in innovation literature, which is we call the recarbonatory view of innovation. Most times we think about innovation, we think about something radical, right? But in reality, most innovations are not radical innovations. Most innovations are what we call recombination of existing knowledge skills, right? So this actually is one perspective, which innovation arises from novel combination of existing knowledge. Don't have to be radical knowledge, right? A novel recombination of this knowledge, right? Now, if this is our perspective, which is we take this as our perspective, then the companies which have diverse knowledge sources will benefit from this recombination. Okay? So firms have access to different type of knowledge. They are more likely to have a novel, new recombination of this knowledge, will lead to more innovation or new products. So and also firms need to invest in their ability to learn, actually cognitive investment in order to have the deliberate learning. Right? Now, so especially for emerging markets, EM means emerging markets, right? Like a BRICS countries, right? So especially for emerging markets can be important in the source of what we call applied knowledge. Okay, don't have to be the cutting edge, frontier knowledge. Emerging market can be the source of applied knowledge, which is actually particularly relevant for other emerging market firms in their product innovation. Okay, so that's the idea we try to empirically test in this particular study. Okay. Limited time, so I'm not going to talk all the details, but just showing the model. What we have is we have firms exporting to other countries, right? By doing that, they have access to overseas knowledge. The overseas knowledge is recombined with the local knowledge, what we call knowledge combination, and leading to what we call innovation. So that's our simple. Now, the focus we focus on in first study is actually is the role of institutions, right? The institutions in international business. So in our literature, what generally we think about institutions, what type of rule we think about, right? So we think about three rules. The first one, institutions are resources, right? Institutions are providing resources. The other is actually institutions are what we call the market supporting mechanism, right? For example, intermediaries, right? Are reducing the transaction costs. And the last one we talk about institutions, we're talking about the institutional differences. Countries are different, right? So the institutional differences, we have this idea in IB, international business, what we call institutional distances. Countries are very different in their institutions, and the differences can be a barrier for firms to learn or know. Okay,
May I raise a question?
Yeah, sure.
So the standard definition of institution is institutions are the rules of the game.
Yeah.
So where is it now?
That's
in this.
How do we get to this, right? So this is more a little bit broad definition, especially in international business area. Institutions are rule of the game, yes. That's the definition. What does exactly rule of the game do for you, for companies? Well, the rule of the game for companies, one actually is providing resources. The other is providing what we call the intermediary, the supporting mechanisms, right? And the third one is actually the differences. Okay, so we look at the rule of game, but in a comparative sense between two countries. You get the point, right? So by exporting to, so this international, global business, so we look at the first countries.
We talk about knowledge, right?
Yeah.
I wonder, you are talking about knowledge of the demand side or knowledge of the supply side.
Okay. That's also very good.
I just clarify.
Yeah. So so that's actually very good. Whether it's a supply or demand. So in fact, by access to different type of markets, you actually see the demand from different type of customers. So if you ask me what exactly, we actually look at the demand perspective. Okay, because customers have different type of demand, so which give you different type of knowledge, and you use that knowledge, the knowledge we combine to have a new product for you. Okay, yeah. So that's
If
basically.
you go to the overseas market, you also have some competitors.
Sure.
And you can also get some knowledge over the supply side from your competitors. Thank you so much.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, very good. But we mainly
Also in
we are from institution focus on the idea by going to a different market, you see different type of customers, could be different suppliers, but you get new knowledge from that particular market, which is different from the knowledge you have in your country. Yeah. Okay. Very good. Okay. So broadly, this is our model, right? So we will have two studies. I will briefly talk about them, so I'm not going to into too details. The first one actually is this hypothesis 1 to 3. Look at the moderating rule of the home country institutions. So institutions within the home market. So that's our first study. The second study obviously is because we talk about international, right, exporting, so there are institutional distances or differences between the two countries. So we also look at the differences between the home country and the destination country, the institution differences, how they can moderating the difference. So two slides. Okay. So I'm not going to talk about each hypothesis in detail because of the time. So what I want to do is to give you an overall picture. So this is the slide I will spend most time on, right? So this is the structure of our hypothesis. What are we going to test? Okay. So what we have is, first study, we have three hypotheses. Okay. The first one is we look at the local market in China, for example, how open is this market to global foreign direct investment, or whether the market is open for global business trade or foreign direct investment. Okay. So the idea is that we are seeing exporters have advantages because they have access to new knowledge which is not available to domestic companies. Okay. However, if the knowledge is available to other domestic companies, if the market is very open, then the unique advantage of being an exporting firm will be diminished. So our first hypothesis is basically when the market is very open, when the market openness of allocation is very high, it's actually reduce the unique advantage of the exporter having access to those signals. So then you see the negative effect on this. Actually, this is moderating effect. So exporting leading to innovation, we look at all these factors moderating this relationship. And if the market is very open, then it's reduced the advantage, unique advantage of the exporter. Okay? So this is the first hypothesis. Now, our perspective is that innovation is a combination of different pieces of knowledge, right? So not only you need to have access to overseas knowledge, you also need to have local knowledge. So we are saying that in locations where government or other firms invest a lot in R&D, they have a lot of local institutional support for local innovation and knowledge, and they actually benefit learning from export. Okay? So we are saying that in locations where the institution provides support for R&D, for example, that will help exporters to combine the overseas knowledge with the local knowledge, which will help make them more innovative. So that's our second hypothesis is that we look at local support for innovation, for R&D, then in locations where there's a lot of support, then you obviously it's very helpful. I have 10 minutes, right? Okay, excellent. Thank you. The third hypothesis is really the role of institutions. The institutions play as a market supporting mechanism, right? Make the market running more efficient, right? What we call intermediaries. So in locations where the institutions are a little bit more well-developed, then it will help more with this, because for example, intellectual property rights being well protected, right? Firms are more likely to get the resources that they need from the market, and that will facilitating the learning from exporting to innovation. Okay? So all these are what we call the home country institutional factors. Okay. So our framework for the first study, I'm now So I have detailed hypothesis for each of the hypothesis, argument for each hypothesis. So I'm not going through all them because I have taught them already. Let me get to the empirical part for the first study. The empirical part is we are using a large database. This is actually annual census of industrial enterprises by National Bureau of Statistics, right? China Statistics Bureau, and also have the the index of market capitalization to use as an indication of institutional development across different locations in China. So this is using data. A 250,000 of Chinese firms, right? These are average Chinese firms who are exporting, and the data is actually there's a special reason for we use this data because the data after 2008, there was a global financial crisis, if you remember, and also from this particular database, our scholars feel the data after 2008, 2009 was less reliable. So most studies focus on the data with the earlier period. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about all the models. It's two-stage general least square model. we look at the instrument variables and so forth. But I'm not going to go through all of them. Basically, our key dependent variables are new products. Okay? So because we look at innovation and look at exporters, so we look at their new product outputs, their sales, and our key independent variable is their export intensity. How much of their sales is exporting to other countries? Right? So typical. And we have our moderators like market openings, regional R&D funding, and also market intermediary development. This actually, for those of you who are familiar with China, this actually is the index developed by finance index, right, about market development. We have a lot of key variables, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that.
But so new product output is not normalized, like it's like log of output.
And we use log as well, but it's pretty much similar.
And you control for total output?
We control, yeah. So we control for total output. That would be our sensitivity model. Have another model which I'll show you later, which is actually using percentage of new product sales. Okay. So, but the results are very much robust. I'm now going to go through the results. So basically, seeing when market is open, learning from exporting is weakened a little bit because exporters do not have unique advantages anymore. But when local markets, local government, local locations support innovation, so actually you have that will enhance the learning from exporting. When firms located in regions which more institutionally developed, like in China, is around the coastal areas, that also help with learning and innovation. So that's basically the key results. This is the answer Albert's question. The first robustness test we did is looking at the new product intensity, which control for the total, this percentage of products, which are percentage of sales, right, which are similar results. We also look at the independent variables. For example, market openings. So we look at the different methods of market openings. In location, for example, the sector trade intensity, sector FDI intensity, and province level trade intensity. So different practical measures, but not. So this mainly means to be a robustness.
Just a quick question. How difficult is it for companies to move from one province to another?
That's a good
question.
question.
Or something like this to bypass, for example, certain restrictive behavior in certain provinces and so on.
A very good question. So in China, for example, I would say now it's not that difficult now. So now it's my colleagues can correct me, right? So now it's firms that have their embedded needs, so they're embedded located in some areas. But now it's not that hard to move to different regions. But what we are looking at is some data 10 years ago, right? So that time is probably less well developed. It's probably not that easy. And firms are not just we are looking at a large data sets, right? So could be some firms move to coastal areas in order to have more, because the institutions there are very developed. Yeah. So we will see how that will affect the study. But we do not have data about when did the firm move or not, how many of them are actually moving.
So everything's cross-sectional in terms of the identification. And I mean, I think the point.
The data are 3-year data. So the data we have are 3 years of using time lagged variables. So being lagged 1 year, like 2 years, but the
you're lagging the
independent variables are being lagged 1 or 2 years. Yeah. So it's a mainly kind of mainly cross section, but we have 3 year data. Right. So there is a time lag there, but we will not be able to look at a particular firm over a long period of time where they have moved the locations in order to, so in a way about selection or alternative issues. But we did, so anticipating all the questions from the audience. So we actually, have all these. Obviously, in exporting, obviously, is that firms which are more innovative tend to export, right? So there's reverse causality, issues which are economists know there's something. So we did quite a number of things, but I don't think I have time to go through all this. So we try instrumental variables, we try 2CG model, we try, obviously there's a lagged, variables are being lagged, right? Lagged variable that we're using, right? So, okay. I'm now going to, let me just summarize and move very quickly to the second study and give you a summary, okay? So we look at building a recombinatory view of innovation, where we look at how home company institutions influence first ability to benefit on export innovation. Okay, so that, so that pretty much the idea I talked about, right? So we look at the motivating effects of human institutions. Excellent. So I have 3 minutes, right? So I'm going to jump into the second study, which I touched upon in the plenary session 2 days ago, right? So the idea for now, rather than look at home company institution, I want to look at differences in institutions, right? Institution differences. And how the institutional differences, okay, so let me just go into the second study. So I actually look at where do they export, okay? Because I actually got this data from Chinese customers, general administration customers. It's millions of transactions, huge database. So the idea we're looking at is where do companies export? Chinese companies, they can export to, the blue is emerging markets, right? And the red is advanced economies. You notice over the last 18 years, what you have is from the export, the growth rate to emerging market has been growing faster than export to advanced economies. So our research question is, where you export, would that matter in how you learn from in your innovation? Okay. So this is actually the idea we bring out with the institutional distances, right? And how institutional distances affects innovation. Okay, obviously we are seeing that for emerging market exporters, other emerging markets may be similar in the home company institutions, level institution development, that actually, so the whole idea is this. So let me show you the model and you can get the point, okay? So the model is that the more similar the institutions are, actually the better they help you to facilitate. So in other way, this should be negative project, right? So in other way, institution distance is a barrier for students. Okay. So 1 minute, what can you do with 1 minute? Well, I can show you the chart, right? Okay. So here we are. So institution distance. Distance is not good for innovation, especially institutional distance. Okay. And that basically is the model. The result. So that's the hypothesis. The data, same data set, but we have the customers data. So we get all, for each company, we know exactly where do they export, which company they do export to. And then from there, we can actually see whether they export into emerging markets or advanced economies. So the key variable here is emerging markets. Okay? So allow me to show you the results, right? Which is basically saying that for companies exporting to other emerging markets, that actually help them to be innovative, have more influence. So that's the key conclusion we have. And in fact, this is quite debatable because this is actually something quite novel. That's the reason why the journal has set up paper, because they feel this is something empirically demonstrates something which we generally do not think is. Okay, time is up. Thank you very much. Okay,
so the next speaker is
Anna Bizaeva.
Oh, that's great.
Anna is the chair of the Department of Finance at New York.
Yes, just started.
Doesn't matter. It's what it is today. Yeah.
So you're correct to say that.
Yeah, I'm correct in saying that.
Where are the slides here?
Yeah.
I think I saw them. glad for this opportunity to welcome all of our guests here. Thank you very much for coming. I hope you'll enjoy being in Moscow and staying here. I hope you like NES and Skolkovo. I'm very much looking forward to to getting to know you more, and I think that the best way to get to know each other for research schools is actually to have some sort of little conference. So I'm very glad, very happy with this idea, to have some little conference, a little workshop to talk about research. The type of research I do is a market microstructure. It's a little subfield of finance that is growing, but it has to deal with transaction costs, with liquidity, with how people trade, how they trade on their information, how they rebalance their portfolios, with high frequency trading and low frequency trading, with market crashes, and lots of interesting things. And I started to do this research thanks to my advisor, whom you may know from MIT, John Wang. So he was actually the guy who brought me into this field, and since that time I'm pretty much doing market microstructure. The main idea on which I have been working over the last 10 years is market microstructure invariance. It's the idea that we have been working on with Pip Kyle, my home colleague from the University of Maryland. So we have sort of a new framework to think about how financial markets work. We call it market microstructure invariance. It's the idea that all markets are the same except for the time that passes at a different speed in different markets. So they can be very fast, active markets, very liquid markets like US Treasuries, for example, with a lot of people trading, a lot of stuff going on. And there can be some very illiquid securities with just maybe a few trades executed per week. But still, our idea is that these markets are the same. It's only the speed that differs across these markets. Fundamentally, they should be the same. And business time we link to ideas that arrive to the marketplace. So in some markets there will be a lot of ideas, in others there will be a few ideas. And we have some special way of how to figure out how many ideas actually arrive about each market, based on some things that we observe, like volume and volatility, essentially. So this is yes, and then if all markets are the same ultimately, they look differently. So the trading cost, liquidity, transaction trades, everything is different. But then when we look at them in business time, they will be all the same. So it's the same trading game that people are playing ultimately. They trade according to the same rules. When we unfold this game again into the calendar time, we start getting all types of weird quantitative predictions about different variables of market microstructure or any other you can come up with, turn out to be related to some powers of volume and volatility, 2/3 powers, 1/3 powers. And then we test these predictions, and it turns out that what we observe in the data actually closely matching our predictions. So we have a bunch of papers on this, and we have derived some results in very conventional frameworks of informational economics, for example, talking about equilibrium models. So we have been deriving these formulas sort of using some somewhat standard approaches. But then we have realized that what we do is much more sort of fundamental, and we probably can derive our formulas from some more fundamental concepts. And so this paper that I wanted to quickly discuss here is actually more similar to physics. So we started to think more about dimensional analysis, things that you may have discussed in the high school, and trying to get, again, our predictions, but from some very basic concepts like dimensional analysis. So, in physics we talk a lot about dimensions. So we talk about mass, distance, time. We talk about conservation, loss of energy, but we don't talk about dimensions much in economics and finance. Even though it's the same, it's science. So we should talk about dimensions. We should make sure that formulas that we are writing have some unit consistency, so that the dimensions on the left-hand side should coincide with dimensions on the right-hand side. So we'll be talking here about units of, in finance, units of currency, of quantity, some sort of shares, contracts, and also units of time. So for us, time is very important, and it goes very deep. Like most of our formulas actually show up because we treat very carefully time and like what happens actually in the time dimension. In terms of what will be similar to the law of energy, conservation of energy from physics? Well, it will be something like no arbitrage arguments that have been properly advanced a lot by people like Stephen Ross and others. So this idea of arbitrage or absence of arbitrage in financial markets is hugely important. And so it's similar to the law of conservation of energy. It's like you cannot make money out of nothing. It's very difficult to make money. So it's the same as energy is conserved. You cannot just get energy out of somewhere. So it's a similar idea. Just a simple example from physics. If we want to know how quickly a pendulum goes back and forth, the time of oscillation of pendulum, you can apply, in physics, people can apply this very simple dimensional analysis. So they just write an instant in time. They just say that probably it's some function of mass of the bulb, of the length of the pendulum itself, L, and G, acceleration of gravity. So G is in meters per square second squared, length is in meters, and mass is in kilograms or grams. Well, at the same time, oscillation of pendulum is in seconds. So how can we combine these three variables to get seconds? Well, we should just divide L by G. Meters will cancel out. There will be seconds squared, and then we take a square root. So we get something that will be seconds. We know that there should be no mass, because mass is in kilograms and we don't have this dimension, so we should just drop it out of our formula. And then this is just, there's a theorem in mathematics and physics, it's called Buckingham pi theorem, that you can essentially write your variable as a combination of your arguments in particular functions to match the dimensions, to match seconds here. And then some function of dimensionless variables. So if there would be some other variables, then we'll have to scale them. If there will be also variable x1 and x2, we'll have to scale them to make dimensionless and put into this function. So then this is our predictions. Then you do experiments in physics, you test whether it's actually true, and it turns out that it's a very good description of this phenomenon. So it's actually that you can quantify that constant. And that will be constant, I forgot, it should be 2 pi here. So it turns out that the formula for t is 2 pi times the square root of L over G. It seems very simple. People do it all the time in physics. There's another example about the size of the first atomic bomb used by Americans, for example. But you can find lots of different examples. So why we don't do this in finance? So we try to do something similar in finance, and there are lots and lots of variables here. We are mostly, variables are like price, trading volume, volatility, tick size, horizon, trade size. We are very much interested in the transaction cost formula because liquidity is the main object in market microstructure. We want to. Everybody is looking for this special formula. It's sort of a holy grail type of formula in market microstructure. And so if we want to, to get a formula for transaction cost, so what is transaction cost? When we execute some order, it moves the price. So it moves the price for some number of basis points. It's actually dimensionless. If you think about this, it's in percent, it's basis points, it has no dimensions. And then we can say that, it should be some function that we don't know of how much we traded. Q, it's in shares, how many shares we traded. Of price, it's dollars per share, rubles per share. Volume, which is how much shares is traded per day. Variance, it's the volatility of returns, it's per day. And then C is just some constant, it's the average cost of executing a bet. So we apply a similar dimensional analysis. We have 3 units, as I mentioned. So we take 3 variables to match the dimensions. It's looks like this. So we take P, Q, and sigma squared. They're all in the power of 0, exponent of 0, because we don't want any units. We don't have any units on the left-hand side, so we shouldn't have any units on the right-hand side. And then there are 2 more variables left. Remember I told you that we have to scale them somehow to make dimensionless. This is what we do. We have this, we introduce these variables, we call them L and Z. Just happen to do so. L, we call this variable, if you do these calculations, you'll see that there are no dimensions here, it's dimensionless. Everything cancels out here. But we call it L because it will be actually, it's something very similar to liquidity. This is our main measure of liquidity. This exponent will be 1/3. Again, it can be any exponent here, but we take it to be 1/3 of, I don't have much time now to go into these details, but we take it to be 1/3 to make it similar to the liquidity. It's actually, this is our main measure of liquidity. And Z is just this other combination of variables. The most important thing is that it's dimensionless. So according to the same pi theorem or Buckingham theorem, the transaction cost formula should be not the function of these 5 variables, but actually the function of these 2 variables only. It's quite an important result because you go from some function of 5 variables, and it would be very difficult to figure out what is that function. Imagine you'll have to do lots and lots of experiments to figure out what's the functional form. And of course, it's much more difficult to make experiments in finance than to do experiments in physics. Because here, when we talk about transaction costs, we talk about huge amounts of money, real money, and transactions. So potentially you can have some data set from some big, maybe financial company, maybe investment bank that does transactions for some institutional clients, so that there is data on executional cost for those orders. And I would not probably be asking them to do any experiments, because probably their clients would be very unhappy. So this fact that by using just simple dimensional analysis we can get this result is quite remarkable. And then we have one more constraint that, briefly speaking, it's similar to Modigliani-Miller type of constraint. So we want to say that if you change, so if you do trading, but you take some of these trades, and to each share you add a bunch of cash. So you sort of change the leverage. Then nothing should change. Fundamentally, it's the same market. Cash is sort of neutral. When you exchange cash, there are no transaction costs. Price doesn't change. So it's sort of based on this idea. The idea that our formulas have also should satisfy this leverage transformation sort of, and it's related to this Modigliani-Miller idea, this main idea in corporate finance, that when you change how you finance your company, the value of the company doesn't change. It's the same here. It doesn't matter how much cash, how much leverage you add into the system, all of the trading should be the same. All of the fundamental predictions should be the same. So we sort of apply this restriction, and skipping a few lines of algebra here, we find that the only way this can be true is when our transaction cost formula is how much price will change in percentage when we execute some large some order, should be 1 over L, this is our liquidity measure, times some function of Z, of this special variable. So it's even more restricted prediction. And this is our main formula. If you actually plug back all of these variables that I discussed, you get something like this. Yes.
So I know you're simplifying it, but the formulas for L and Z they're derived from some basic theoretical assumptions, or?
These are just combinations, like how we need to transform these variables to make them dimensionals. And then we just, there is some degree of freedom, so we could select slightly different variables. Ultimately, we'll get similar formula, actually. But just these variables have some economic intuition that L is this one, it's this scalar. So it scales transaction cost regardless of how large the size of the order is. And this is sort of a typical, this is size relative to the median trade size, something like that. So this is how large the size of the order is, this Q. And this one, and it may differ because people execute orders, small orders, large orders. And this is liquidity measure, that is a characteristic of the market. So we just, yes, we selected them in this particular way. But let me just show you a bit. Yes, and in this formula there were also this constant C that was in dollars that we needed. This is the average cost of execution in bet. We cannot get rid of it. And invariance is actually saying that this one is constant across all markets, across all times, across all asset classes and across countries. So whether it's true or not, we can check. So far, it worked quite well whenever we tested it in different countries. And so we can test some predictions on whether this is 1/3, that exponent is 1/3. And let me just show you some of the empirical results here. As I said, this is the measure of liquidity, so we can test. We tested using the Russian data, Moscow exchange. NES works quite closely with the Moscow exchange. Happily for me, doing market microstructure. So we have data from Moscow exchange, for example, and we also then our referees ask us to do the same for some more standard data, like American or British data. So we also did this for more conventional, American data. And for example, the prediction that we would test, the simple one, is that spread. Spread is the fixed component of transaction cost formula. So this spread, this is percentage spread, ask minus b divided by price, should be proportional to our measure of liquidity. Our measure of liquidity is very complicated with all these powers. But we predict this coefficient, we predict this equality. So when we take logs, it's nicely, it should be coefficient of 1. So we look at whether this coefficient is actually equal to 1 or not.
So J here is indexing
J is security and T is time. Okay. We just took 1 year, 250 days. Finance 1 year is 250 days. And then we have different number of securities. In Russia, we took the main 50 securities in RTS index, and then in the US it's 500 from S&P 500. So for each security, each of the 250 days, we just calculate spread, and then calculate our strange measure of liquidity, and then we put it into one chart. So that's what we have. On the horizontal axis, it's 1 over L, log of 1 over L. Here it's log of percentage spread. And this red line, it's exactly the slope. It has exactly the slope of 1. So when we do just a simple regression, you get 0.998, which is very, very close to 1. And in these different colors, these are different stocks. This is the Russian data, so there will be 50 different colors. So for each of the colors, there will be 250 dots. So you can see it's remarkably close to what we would predict. For American data, this is what we got. It was much more difficult to get American data, and it's much more expensive. But thanks to University of Maryland for getting access to this data. So you can see that the coefficient is still very close to 1. It's pretty much the same result, but the data is much more dispersed here. There are much more. It works worse than the Russian data.
I have a quick question. How do we know that L is liquidity? L
We need
measures
to talk.
liquidity.
Yeah, we need to talk more about it. If you look at how it is defined, it's a typical transaction cost for typical order. Like if you just look carefully in the formulas, I can explain it to you.
Yeah, but liquidity is actually a very elusive concept. There are many dimensions, right?
So this particular measure, it's related to all of the concepts of liquidity, to bid-ask spread, to price impact, to resilience, to pricing accuracy, but it has some particular equation. There are some particular relationships that we also derive from this in this framework. So we yes.
So the theory says the slope should be the same for every stock, right?
For everything.
So how do you account for differences across? Is there a theory that can explain differences across stocks?
So there are, yeah, you can see that if you look at all these lines for each stock, sometimes they're hitting one, sometimes they're not. This is sort of a research question.
You think it's just kind of?
No, we think that any deviation from this line is hugely important and has to be investigated in lots of detail. So we came up with when we thought about this, we thought about different explanations. Some of them would be related to some econometrics, some biases that may arise there. Some of them will be more economic. So it's very important to talk about all these deviations. We got similar predictions, for example, for the number of trades. So there, the coefficient should be true because the number of trades should be sort of proportional to L squared. And these are pictures that we got, the same pictures, but with the log of the number of trades per day on the vertical axis for US, for Russian data, and this is for US data. It looks nice, except like it looks really beautiful. So this is just the type of research I do. I would say it's a bit it's not typical it's typical in topics I discuss. It's not typical in methods I used at all. But this can be extended quite a lot. So maybe transaction costs depend on some other parameters. Then you can write them down. You can transform them to make them like horizon, for example, some market fictions. You can transform them into something dimensionless and leverage neutral, and then just add into this formula. And so you can we pretty much have this very powerful machinery of generating different quantitative predictions for different variables. And surprisingly, we sort of both of us, me and Pete, are trained to be, in classical school to be financial economists, and Pete has been probably a pillar of modern finance. But what we came to ultimately looks like physics. And if finance and economics are really science, then maybe it should be this way. Maybe it's not a surprise. So thank you very much. Let me stop here, and I'll be glad to discuss any of these ideas maybe later.
Maybe later. We'll have some time. No, actually, after the next presentation, we'll have a coffee break.
Okay, so from one finance head to another. Sudan.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me here. This is the first time I present finance paper to a broader audience. I hope I don't bore you. So today I'm going to talk about the insider trading regulation in China, and this is joint work with Korea, who is at the East China University of Politics and Law, and Professor Kemin Wong from Fudan University. So we've been working on this for a long time. Okay, so let me just quickly go through this. Insider trading is regulated in most countries. There's a hot debate on whether or not these regulations work or not. Right? And so in this paper, we actually studied a very specific regulation enacted in 2008 and finished in early 2014. I will explain to you later what is the so-called unlocked restricted stocks later on. And basically, we claim that this regulation is quite innovative. It's not been seen, it hasn't been seen elsewhere, but there is a flaw in the design. So this is become the focus of the paper, right? And we propose a so-called separated equilibrium explanation of this phenomenon we observe and provide some empirical evidence. So this is basically what we do. All right, let me quickly go through the literature. The inside trading regulation has huge literature, right? But there's two basically branches that are related to this particular study. One is regarding the strategic behavior of insiders. Once we have the regulation, insiders will try to avoid explicitly violating the regulations. So for example, suppose the regulation says that 1 month before the earning announcement, insiders are not supposed to trade, then they will be carefully time their trade, let's say 5 weeks before. So a lot of restriction can be circumvented. So there's evidence from UK, evidence from US. I'm not sure I'll go through detail. The second branch of literature is that the regulations are supposed to be to help the average outside investors, right? Because they don't want insiders to take advantage of average outside investors. But in reality, the average outside investors don't get much benefit. It is, although insiders may get some get hurt because of the regulations, but it's not. It's mostly the profit goes to the groups of people known as information specialists. These are the lawyers, accountants. They are affiliated with the company, affiliated with the insiders. Right? They got a lot of benefit, right? Because of the regulation. Right? The average investors actually don't get. So there are several papers talking about this. These two things are related to what we study. Right. So let me give you a little bit of institutional background in China. China's stock market developed very quickly over the last 10 to 20 years. Right? Especially during this the sample period that we focus on. Right. And what the restricted share or non-tradable shares refers to the shares that are held by basically all levels of governments and some government-related affiliated institutions. So probably know, like Russia, China's industry used to consist of state-owned enterprises. And over time, they are private enterprises, right? But probably unlike Russia, China took a more gradualist way of doing it. So what happened is that many state-owned enterprises carve out a small piece of their probably best asset and list them on the exchange. The parent company still maintain roughly say 50% of shares. These shares initially was deemed as non-traded, indefinite. There's no date market to it. It's just saying these are not traded, right? Held by the basically government, all levels governments. And then the remaining, say, 50% is sold, shares are sold to the public to raise the fund. Basically, at the time, a lot of these state-owned enterprises are technically broke, right? So, all right. So then, but this causes some problems because the parent company, they hold a lot of shares, but they are not tradable. So the parent companies do not have incentive to improve their prices because they can't sell it anyway. Right? There's some study showing that if a parent company wants to sell this the non-tradable shares privately to another, say, government institution, government or institutions, the value they get is only 20% on average. Right? You can offer the market value being traded. So there are also other problems, right, associated with this ownership. So at around, I think it started from 2005, the government implemented something called split share reform. Basically, each firm, for each firm, the parent company, all these non-tradable shareholders negotiate with tradable shareholders to make these non-tradable shares tradable. But the non-tradable shareholders must compensate tradable shareholders because the issue is the following. At the time when firms are listed, the government share actually is worth nothing because they don't contribute anything. This is existing assets that are not valuable, right? So the tradable shares, this is mostly small investors. When they buy these shares, the book value of the non-tradable share was still at 1 RMB per share, and they have they actually made assumption if these because this is indefinite non-tradable at the time, so they think this is always one RMB per share. But over time, by the year 2005, this has been tripled and quadrupled. So the market value per share is a lot more than one RMB. So the two sides have this debate. And if suppose you want to make this non-tradable share tradable, basically you want to allow them to sell. At what price you can sell? The tradable shareholders think that these non-tradable shareholders should sell the shares to them through rights issuing at book value of 1 RMB. Of course, the government doesn't want to do this, right? So there's a lot of discussion and proposals. Every time there's a proposal, there's a market will panic, right? So, but at the end of 2005, eventually they come up with a solution. So they negotiate so that non-tradable shareholders compensate tradable shareholders. This is done through negotiation. So whatever, if you don't want to do it, you miss the opportunity, right? If you want to do it, just sit down and work it out. So this has become a huge success. I'll show you the evidence. Okay, and also there's a lot of new IPOs, new firms coming to the market. So on one hand there's non-tradable shares become tradable, but with a period being in which the shares will be locked up. Or after this locked period, then the shares can be sold to the market. In the meantime, the new listed firms, new IPOs, also have the similar restriction, right? The owners cannot sell typically a year or 2 years after that. Okay, so basically there's a lock period. As a result, you see a lot of non-tradable shares become tradable, and I'll show you the numbers so you'll see. So here I show you some graphs. This is I'm not sure whether you can see it. This is the beginning of 2006. This is end of 2012. Okay, and I plot the index. Shanghai Stock Exchange and Shenzhen Stock Exchange. These are two stock exchanges in China, two main stock exchanges in China. I rescaled such that at the beginning of 2006, it's 100. In less than 2 years, the price went from 100 to either this is 500 for Shanghai Stock Exchange, or almost 700 in Shenzhen Stock Exchange. This is, we don't see this very often, right? But this is what happened. But then by the end of 2008, it dropped almost back to the where they started. Okay, so this is a huge fluctuation, and of course there's the international influence because 2008 happened to be a global financial crisis. But if you look at this graph, this part is the earnings per share. Earning. This is earning divided by book value of the share. That number is very stable, except for the fourth quarter of 2008. Okay, so these are fundamentals, and this is stock prices. So the point here is that the huge fluctuation, okay, in the stock prices cannot be fully explained by the fundamentals. Fundamentals basically didn't change much.
So is this spike similar to this recent spike which is called the margin loans?
It's not really. This spike is basically because of this share fall. Before that, if you extend this to the year 2000, it would be probably at 200. So over the year 200 to 2005, the prices dropped by roughly by half because of all the discussion on this, how to make the tradable stock shares tradable. So over the 5-year period, there's no progress. But then this all of a sudden. So this part is solely because of this split shift before. So the third one, okay, shows you the following. You see there is a hollow bars and solid bars. The hollow bars are the non-tradable shares. Okay, they're non-tradable. This solid bars are tradable. Over time, you see, before roughly 2008, 2009, there are more non-tradable shares than tradable shares. But after that, changed because of this reform. Okay, and this part plot among the tradable shares, how much is held by insiders, and how much is held by outside investors. Insiders are defined as top managers, directors, and any individual institution that held more than 5% of company shares. That's the official definition. Right? We follow the same definition because this is how we find data. So you also see that there are a lot more shares that are held by insiders. There are more shares held by insiders than outsiders. All right. So this is again something that you don't see. All right. Okay. Someone is helping you. All right. So this is a big problem for the regulators. They help form this reform, but now it becomes a sword of Damocles. Because if any of the insiders decide to sell just a small portion of their holdings, will cause huge damage. The price will basically crash. So there's some new regulation. So let me just talk about regulation. China has regulation very similar to the US before 2008. And there is a 2005 regulation that will involve some reporting requirement. I'm not going to emphasize. The main one is this one. It's 2008. Basically, the China Security Regulatory Committee issued something called a guideline, briefed as guideline, saying that if you are insider and if you want to sell your shares within 1 month's time of more than 1% of the total share of the company, you have to sell it in the so-called block trade system, not the usual retail market. Okay, and that regulation is kind of innovative because we haven't seen this. We don't see this elsewhere. I may be wrong. I don't know any market with such a regulation. It's innovative because, first of all, I will explain to you later. The block trade system is separated with retail market, so they don't affect, at least during the day. Maybe afterward there might be some information effect, but they are not directly related. Secondly, the so-called the block trade system. Basically, the participants are institutions and some very wealthy individuals. So they are more knowledgeable. So by forcing the insiders to trade with institutions, and you can somehow protect the average investors. Okay? Let me just make an example. Suppose there's a company, the price currently is 100. Okay? Suppose, let's say, Anna is the insider, and she believes that the stock actually is now worth 100, maybe it's 90. Okay? And suppose Anna wants to sell it because of this regulation. And let's say Anna find me as an institution. Right? Say, okay, I want to sell this. How much can you pay? Right? Now, if I'm a long-term investor, and if I am knowledgeable enough, I know that this stock is only worth 90. I wouldn't want to pay more than 90 to buy from Anna. Okay? So of course, Anna can shop around and try to find someone else. But suppose all the people that Anna meet give her the same answer, right? So Anna might say, okay, now 90, I'm not selling because I might as well just hold it, keep holding it. Or even if you decide to sell it, no harm done because this is selling at the right price, fair price. Nobody gets hurt, right? So that's one situation. However, if I'm not a long-term investor, suppose I'm also short-term oriented. If I insist that Anna sells me at 90, Anna may decide not to sell, so I get nothing. Right? Suppose what I can do is the following. Suppose, let's say, Pava is an average outside investor, right? And he doesn't know that the stock is worth only 90. He thinks it's 100, right? So what I can suppose is 2%. We're talking about 2% of the total share. Suppose I tell I can take 94. Although I know it's only worth 90. I say, okay, I take 94. Right? I buy it at 94, and then I turn around, sell, because I'm not an insider. I only buy 2%. I'll try to sell in the retail market gradually, split into small portions and sell it in the next week. Right? And then a few weeks later, information leaked out. The share is not worth 100, dropped to 90. Okay? Then Anna basically gave $4 per share. Okay? Suppose I sold shares to Palo an average of 97. Okay? This is a very conservative number. Then I also gained $3. Right? So there are $4 and $3. I gain $3. Anna gained $4. How about this? because it's 97, but a few weeks later at 90. All right? So this is very possible. So this is basically our hypothesis, because this regulation does not restrict the counterparty of the block trade to resell the share in the retail market. This is something that they should have included. Yeah, so basically there is an implicit possibility of collusion, right? This is collusion. So this is a very interesting phenomenon. So yeah, of course everything is legal. So what is a block trading system? I'm just briefly mention this. There is some requirement. If you want to trade in a block trade system, either the volume should be high enough or value should be high enough, and it's not. This is something people volunteer to in trading, and this is typically done after retail market. After the retail market closes, and then two-side trade. Okay, all right. I have only 3 minutes. It's a pity. So this is the. Let me see. There's so-called buyer-initiated, seller-initiated block trade, depending on the price of the block trade. If the block trade price is lower than the closing price of the retail market, then it's seller initiated, because you want to sell, you are willing to take a lower price, and that is called a discount. On average, the discount is 6%. Okay, all right. Okay, so this is what our hypothesis, because insiders sometimes sell shares for informational reasons. Now, if you think this is overpriced, you want to sell it. Sometimes they sell for diversification purpose, right? If you hold too much, you want to reduce your holding. But our prediction is the following: because of this discount, if you are selling for informational purpose, and you think that currently the stock price is too high and will fall quickly, then you're willing to sacrifice 6% and sell it in the block trade market. If you are doing this for diversification purpose, then you are not in a rush. You can just sell piece by piece over a long time, over a much longer time, right? So there is such a hypothesis. So how do we know this? We can only test the implication. So this is the implication. If we follow first of all, the counterparties, right, do not have incentive to demand higher discount, right? Because if you demand too high discount, there may not be any deal, right? So and they do not want to hold it for too long, because if you hold it for too long, you may lose. And stock price will fall afterwards, right? But it's for block sales and retail sales, they're different. Stock prices will fall more for block sale. Okay? And also, it's possible that the earnings of the insiders, the earnings for the firm with insider sales will be lower. So high insider sale will predict lower future earnings. And this is also one possibility. Okay? So we basically provide all the evidence. I skip all this data. This is the descriptive statistics. And this is before the guideline, after guideline. You see the amount of insider sales is still huge after the. Okay, sorry. It's huge after the guideline. So in some sense that the guideline didn't start insider sales. But of course, it's very difficult to do the before and after comparison, because a lot of things happen over the time. But one thing I want to show you is that this is a discount. This is the before and this is after. And you see, after the guideline, the discount is, on average, is slightly higher. However, there's a discount for insiders, a discount for non-insiders on the block sale system. The one that for for insider actually is lower. That's very unusual because block sales, the counterparties actually know each other. So you can assume that for insiders, discount should be higher because you have some information, right? There must be a reason you want to sell. So usually it should be higher, but it's actually slightly lower. That's very, very, very strange. But
you're giving up control as well, right? Along the way.
Yeah, so we're talking about this one. We're talking about okay. The typical, the largest shareholder typically hold 40% of the total company, and the thing we're talking about is basically 1 to 3%. So yeah, you give up control a little bit, but sometimes they also buy. We're looking at the sell, but they also find a good time to buy back, so they don't actually lose control. Over actually longer period, this is in our sample, we see that there's only very small reduction of the total holding by the largest 10 shareholders. So this is not an issue. All right, because I run out of time. You see, this is the stock price. This is the so-called risk-adjusted returns, and basically you see the difference is one is for following the block sales, one is for retail sales. Block sales, after block sales, you lose more. Yeah, this is stock retail price, retail market price, following insider sale. Time 0 is the day that insider sale started. This is the day 60, trading day 60. So the stock price dropped a lot more for block sales. Go inside the block.
What is the price at which they sell? Is it like
This is car. This is cumulative return.
but
These
you
are
didn't
return.
hold the price itself?
No, this is return incorporate all the price.
Yeah, but where will be?
If it's negative, this is the cumulative return. It's like the price. It's like calling the time of the sale as 0. What happened afterwards? Does that make sense to you?
But the execution price.
Execution price is typically 6% below. You see the discount. It's actually
Somewhere
typically 6% below the retail price of the day. All right. So when you sell in a block sale system, you have to take a discount, which is typically 6% below the retail price of the day. All right. So we also do this, the previous picture is for the average. This is the cross section.
Try to wrap up.
Okay, sorry.
Otherwise you have-
All right. So this is car depending on a lot of things. Okay, I don't have time. Sorry for that. Sorry for that. I think I'll leave the slide here. You can, if you're interested, you can present it. Okay, ask Anna to present it for me, and for my HKUST colleague, I can do it again. You are interested.
Maybe you can sum up.
Just to
The conclusion
conclude.
is that all the predictions have evidence. The most difficult part is what counterparties do, because we don't have data on this. So we made a lot of effort finding evidence that counterparties actually sold. A lot of them sold the stock next day in the retail market. Because
so
we
the-
really don't have data.
And so the fix is just to not allow resale.
Huh?
So you can fix this problem, or you can't?
I cannot fix problem.
I mean-
The regulator can fix problem. You can basically say that, okay, the counterparties are not allowed to sell the stock to the retail market for, let's say, 4 months. Then I will be careful when I buy from Anna, right? I just say, okay, you know, because within a month, the stock price may fall, I don't want to pay more to buy. And so it's very easily fixed. Right? Can you
Have you shared the planning with the regulator?
tell you what, this paper was written 5 years ago. I presented at HKMA, and HKMA people told me that they can, introduced me to the CIC people. I know that the research, they have a research group. The head of the research group is actually a very young graduate from the US. I thought about it and decided not to do it because I was criticizing them. And I don't think they will like it.
You should do it.
Yeah. No, I think now they are more open-minded. I believe now they are more open-minded. But at the time, I hesitated, so I didn't do it. And this paper is still not published. 5 years later, I think one of the reasons is that Americans don't care. This is China; they don't care. And for lesser journals, we don't want to. I spend so much time on it. I don't want to waste my effort, right? So I haven't submitted to a lower journals. So we're still working on it. I sometimes think that if the top journals are in Russia, we may have a better chance.
On this too,
So let's.
So there's a coffee break down on the second floor. Let's go now.
Okay, so maybe we'll take 10 or 15 minutes.
Yeah.
We're going to go over, I think.
Yeah.
Probably by maybe.
I trust you.
No, I'm just Some people are still in the elevator, right?
It's actually on the focus looking at spine and humans. So I have a little team of guys that are physics, economics students. And they would like to take it. So, and also the microphone. So that they exchange, so microfinance exchange. And I'm thinking of how to apply this idea to the exchange market, and also transactions data of individual investors, as well as online investments and other transactions. And also I have so we should talk about this and apply it to our data sets. And we all have non-data sets. So we convinced a bank which we convinced to give us data for the individual customers and the payments. And for this we have 10 billion payments. Individual transactions. So it's everything that goes from the account. So it could be the consumption of coffee, it's the rent that you pay, everything that goes from the taxes you pay.
So who's going to control time?
So I'm not
Huh?
that's actually how to buy it. Yes, we should think about the other two. That's the question on the investment and the individual investment decisions. So you have the finance and you also have the for me it's complicated enough.
You need to leave by 15, the latest. By 15 we need to leave. So you do the math, right?
Yeah, I'm doing that. Okay. Why don't we get started? We have to be out of the building at 5:15 at the latest. So Shlomo and I have, because we were the bad planners who tried to cram so much into the time, we both pledged to try to shorten our presentation.
It's just not too accommodating, yeah?
Yes, that's right. I'm talking about microfinance. I thought, since I knew there would be finance people as well as economists in the audience, I'd pick a title that has the word finance in it, and maybe that would have more
to give you the
interest.
sign of 3 minutes left, 1 minute left.
I will do it. I will do it.
Shlomo was I have a stopwatch here. So, microfinance programs, microfinance is a term that encompasses a broad set of institutional innovations designed to make credit more accessible to poor households who don't have collateral and who in many cases, formal financial institutions just exclude them from borrowing. The most famous model was established by Muhammad Yunus in Bangladesh. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. And he set up a program for poor women in urban Dhaka where they gave loans without collateral to groups of women, and they achieved very high repayment rates. And there's a lot of debate over which features of the program were responsible for its success. One feature was there were joint liability where the groups of women self-selected. They only included other members who they trusted, so they formed their own groups. And also, they were jointly liable for loans, so they monitored each other, because if one person didn't repay, the others, in principle, would be liable for paying their loans on their behalf. Also, there was a lot of effort made in terms of outreach to these groups. There was a promise, if you repay on time, you'll get a new, larger loan, so there were some dynamic incentives. And at the time, it was viewed as this tremendous successful model. Conservatives loved it because it was people helping themselves. Liberals loved it because it was addressing directly poverty issues. And people made a lot of assumptions about the actual impacts. There were an early study found very positive income effects. This was published in the Journal of Political Economy by Mark Pitt and Shahid Kanker. And there have been some other papers which have also found benefits of microfinance type interventions. But there's also been some controversy. Even with the original Pitt and Kanker study, there were other people, Jonathan Morduch at NYU, and published papers using the same data, arguing that the results were very fragile, and if you chose a different econometric specification or really explored some of the identifying assumptions of the empirical work, that they didn't hold up. And so recently, as many of you may know, in development economics, there's a growing kind of fad to doing these randomized control trials in the field, which is often feasible in poor countries because it's much cheaper to implement these programs and do surveys and collect data. And so in a relatively recent symposium volume in the AEJ Journal of Applied Economics in 2015, there was a set of 6 different studies, all in different countries, evaluating the impact of microfinance programs. Many of them are based roughly on the Grameen type models, but not all of them the same. And what was amazing about the studies is none of them found evidence that microfinance significantly increased household income or consumption. And these were randomized control trials, so the recipients were randomly selected. The econometric evaluation is very simple because the randomization makes it very easy to do the comparison and the assessment. And so this has led to a lot of rethinking about whether these programs actually are very effective in lifting people out of poverty. And this is coming some years after the original kind of microfinance movement. So in the introductory chapter to this volume, Abhijit Banerjee, Dean Carlin, and Zinman point out several things that might explain the lack of robust impacts on income and consumption. One is low take-up or differential take-up of the loans. All of the impact assessments look at the intent to treat effect, which means what is the impact of having access to the loan, not of actually taking the loan. And they do that because there's a strong concern in financial and credit demand that there'll be spillover effects. If one household gets a loan, then it may raise that household's income, and then they'll lend to other households. And so it's hard to identify the effect of the treatment on the treated because of these spillovers. So all of the evaluations just focus on these intent to treat effects. And so in that context, take-up is really important in terms of affecting the actual impact of introducing a program into a village. So of course it could be that there's just no real demand, that there aren't very many good projects, or that people can get what they need from existing financial institutions or other lending sources. Some people have argued that loans are not just used to raise incomes, but they're used to smooth consumption and perhaps make investments that are much longer term, including children's education, that you won't see the impacts of right away. there's some context where the gains in being able to finance own businesses leads to a phenomenon where people who had formerly been migrating outside to work come back to participate in the higher, more profitable self-employed activity, and so the increase in self-employment income is offset by the reduction in the wage income when there's a very well-developed labor market. So this also can reduce the total income effects of programs. And there are also certain features of the loan products themselves which might reduce the risk-taking and return of the projects. Many of these programs require the borrowers to repay some of the loan every week. Often they have to hold meetings and pay in front of their neighbors, so there's kind of a public aspect to it too that's supposed to encourage timely repayment. And people have argued, and there's been other RCT that has shown that this weekly repayment makes the borrowers feel much greater pressure to choose projects that have more immediate cash flow and are often less risky and less profitable projects. And then in some of the designs, spillovers may also explain the lack of significant effects if the benefits to the treated areas are spilling over to the control areas. Not so much an issue for us in the Chinese case. So I'm going to kind of skip most of the motivation for China. China has had state-run financial institutions. Most farmers before our program in our treatment areas, if they borrowed, would borrow from things called rural credit cooperatives. But access was somewhat limited, as we'll see. So in this study, we provide a systematic assessment of a specific village banking program in China based on a randomized controlled trial. And unlike all of those 6 earlier studies, or any other study of which we're aware, we find evidence of substantial income increases from both self-employment activity and wage employment. And so we've spent a lot of time after getting these results convincing ourselves that they're robust, given all those other studies don't find results. But then once we were convinced that they were real, trying to understand why we're getting big effects in China and those other studies are not getting big effects in those other countries. And so that's led to a lot of kind of meta-analysis of our study compared to those studies. And so I want to conclude with a discussion of linking it back to that literature, that recent literature. And it also tends to have a very powerful poverty reduction impact, which is good news. I've over the years, been involved in several evaluation papers, studies that have assessed the Chinese government's official poverty reduction programs. And so this is actually a program which is being run by the Chinese government and has been scaled up. So, I should point that out. We're doing a randomized control trial, but our model is not something we created. Our model is really trying out the government's own village banking program. And it's a program that began in 2006 with 100 trial villages. And by the end of 2011, which is about when we were collecting our second follow-up data, it had reached over 16,000 villages in 28 provinces in China. And I don't know the up-to-date figure, actually, of the final scale-up. And the
question.
I have a question about the program itself. So you said it is run by the state. What are the incentives of the officials to run this program? Do we have any career concerns in the relative to...
So China has a leading group for poor area development and an office under it at the national level, at the province level, and most relevant here at the county level government. So there's county officials who are in charge of the program. The central government has put a lot of emphasis on poverty reduction objectives, so it does weigh heavily, or more heavily than probably in most places in terms of officials' work performance assessment. That said, county government officials also are incentivized for economic growth and other things which could lead to trade-offs in terms of the places they select to target the resources. The resources themselves come through a variety of channels, Ministry of Finance, through the banking system. When they get down to the county, it's relatively harder, I think, to manipulate the actual financing, but in terms of where you approve the projects or where you implement the programs, there might be some selection going on. The program was pretty simple. I mean, the government just endowed a village credit fund. And so it was about $32,000 US per village. Most came directly from the national government, some from membership fees. And then the funds were actually governed not by these kind of government officials, but by a kind of a governance committee and a manager who was elected by the members, people who said they were going to pay this fee and get loans from this program. And they were allowed to set the duration of the loans, the interest rates, the repayment terms, and so it varied across places. In most places, the loans were, I think, 5,000, maybe it says here, typically 5,000 renminbi, and in our, so I'm just going to go right on to the program. We did the intervention in 5 provinces, 2 counties in each province, total of 10 counties. Each county, there were 5 villages selected to the program. They were filtered through the recommendation of the county government. The request was to pick, all of the villages are officially designated poor villages in China, so they were targeted towards poor villages. And the counties were asked to nominate villages that were representative of the poor areas in their village. And at the end, they selected 5, and then we randomized which 3 were treated and which 2 were controlled among the ones that they nominated.
So just coming back to those bank loans, so the lending is facilitated through the banks, and the borrowers themselves are choosing the contract terms, right?
Yes, the funds, the $32,000 would be dumped into a bank account in a local bank, state bank, that the village would have access to, but they would control all the disbursement.
Okay, but the contract terms, the loan contract terms, actually, so you mentioned that maturity is chosen by the borrowers themselves and so forth.
Right.
Okay, so that's quite different from the standard microfinance loan, right?
Yeah, that's different than Grameen. What is similar is they did, maybe I have another slide. Okay, so yeah, here's the slide I was looking for. They did do group lending of 5 to 7 households with joint liability. The typical loan was, the interest rate they chose was 10%, which is a little bit below market. And the duration was a 1-year loan, was the modal loan product.
What about the frequency?
No weekly repayment.
Okay, so that makes it quite different.
One-time loan, yeah.
So the channel from which you get these results, these benefits, could actually flow through loan contract characteristics.
Yes, in particular, the fact that we don't have the weekly repayment, which is different than many.
It shortens well, when you have these weekly repayments, you have relatively short effective maturity of the contract, which basically affects everything from risk taking to the income.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So we don't do anything fancy with the econometrics. It's an intent to treat effect. We put in county fixed effects. We do control from baseline year some village characteristics to soak up some of the differential trends by village. But we're basically just saying what happens in terms of the income growth or consumption growth or other changes as a function of being in a treatment village as opposed to a control village. And so we do balance tests, attrition tests. There's no, so the randomization worked fine. There's no evidence that attrition was different in the control and treatment villages in terms of the follow-up. And so let me just get to results. Before the program started, about 61% of households already had some type of borrowing. Most of those were consumption loans. So about half of the households said they had borrowed from friends or relatives or others for consumption purposes. Only 23% for production, and only 5% had borrowed from a formal financial institution, credit cooperative or bank, for production, and 13% for any reason, 13%. So this is, in a rural setting, a relatively low penetration rate of formal financial institutions. Once the program started, these are kind of the impact estimates now. In the treated villages, you see 23% increase in households getting loans from the village bank. So compared to 0 in the controls, 23% take-up rate. And then there's a very slight crowding out of formal loans. So 4% fewer households get loans in the treated villages. And there's very little effect on the informal loans for production. Now this is just for loans for production. There was some crowding out of loans borrowing for consumption, but I don't want to kind of get into that right now in the interest of going forward. Okay, so what happened to income? So this is pre-transfer income, meaning it's just earned income. And we just divide earned income into two categories: self-employed income, which is mainly farming, cropping, growing crops, and raising livestock, and a little bit of other non-farm business. Employment income is wage income, a lot of it from out-migration. In poorer areas in China, lots of people now migrate to distant cities, especially to coastal China for factory jobs, etc. And here you can see that the impacts, these are, again, intent to treat effects. There are over 2,000 renminbi for both self-employment and employment, with a total of 4,000 renminbi increase, and the mean at baseline was just 8,000. So this is like a 50% increase in income as an intent to treat effect. So it's very large, and income per capita, similarly, you see this very large effect. And when we normalize by the population of the household, the effects are more significant and larger for the wage income. Okay. And if we break it down by sources of income, basically what's interesting is you're going to find that income is increasing across all margins. So in cropping, this is for cropping, you see most of the action is happening because of an increase in cash crop sown area. So they're planting more of the land to cash crops when they take loans. This is a sown area unit of mu, which is a unit of area of cropping land. And so cash crop area goes from 2.37 on average in control villages, increases by 0.49, so about by 25%. And this does lead to more revenue and profit. And for livestock, similarly, you see an increase in the inputs invested in crop and livestock, especially feed. And then if you look at the labor supply, the working days, this is now working days per household member measured at N-line, so there's no pre-measure of this because of the way the data was collected. You do see that there's a treatment effect of about 9 additional working days per person, and the mean and the baseline is 119. But what's most interesting is this table, which shows that it wasn't just, and this is total days of work by all members of the household, so the units are a little bit different than the previous table. You can see that there's an increase in 26 wage employment days, but almost all of this is happening in foreign provinces. So if you break down where the work is occurring, home village, home township, home county, home province, all of the action is in migration. That the number of days spent outside the province has increased by 25, which is pretty much the whole effect. And fewer people are working in the village. Time. Okay. So let me then just say a few words about what explains this. So we do a set of tables connecting this to the other studies. So this is our study. These are the 6 studies in the volume I mentioned, and then there's another study from Thailand which was published in the QJ by Kabaski and Townsend. And they find actually an effect which is positive, but it's not experimental. And so let me just, rather than go through all of these numbers, let me just offer a few insights and what I think is explaining why we find these effects in China. That these are the things that make sense. And if you look at the details of those studies, the reason China differs from those studies differs with each of those studies. And so you can see that
there was relatively low penetration of formal borrowing before the program, a very high take-up rate in the Chinese program compared to most of those other programs. This one time rather than frequent repayment may explain it. That's a bit hard for us to quantify. But then another big thing in China, in this Chinese context, was this big increase in wage employment income, which was way more than any other places. And here it maybe makes sense. China is this place with a booming off-farm market, and many other developing countries don't have a lot of high-wage non-farm opportunities if you can get, even if you can get to destinations. A lot of developing countries have sprawling urban slums with a lot of low-pay self-employment and very difficult to get good jobs in factories, etc. And also in China, because the poor people are in the interior and the jobs are on the coast, you really do need to go pretty far. So the cost of getting those access to those high-wage employment jobs is quite different. And so in the poor villages that we're looking at here, many of them are not in the non-farm market. China as a whole has a lot of people migrating, but in these poor villages, it's actually relatively small, even compared to the other countries. Yeah.
This is a conjecture. Right? Yes. At one point cannot.
Yes, but no, but we have 8 data points, right? I mean, I'm not showing you the numbers, but if you do the comparisons, everything I said is borne out by the comparisons to the other programs. We know all of the similar data about the wages in farm and non-farm, the amount of labor allocated farm and non-farm, and the impact sizes on both self-employment income and wage income. So I could take you through a blow-by-blow to give you more convincing assessment.
These things are country-wide features, not individual, you know, at individual.
Well, specifically,
so basically you only have one outlier there.
Yes, of course. I mean, each study occurs in a different country, but each study is for a very small group of households.
Right.
So even within a country, it may not fully generalize. Ours is better than most because we're in 5 provinces, 10 counties, reasonably representative, I think, of what you'll find in China. Any other question back here?
One question I was wondering, which you don't mention here, but I saw in your presentation earlier, is that the interest rates are remarkably low compared to many of the other programs, and in fact also lower than the competition, because the cooperatives were at 12 something, this program is at 9, so there will be substitution of good subjects from the old program to the new program, but it's just cheaper to also avoid adverse selection, and these are things that are different also from the other countries. So often it was 20, 25, and pretty expensive.
Right. So it's unusual for microfinance programs to offer interest rates that are below the going rate.
It's unusual, and that's also a specific thing, I would say.
Right. But there's very little credit because there's very little access to those formal loans to start with. Yeah. But you also might think that a low interest rate actually hurts, reduces the probability of high income effects because it means everyone wants the loan. So you start to get these adverse selection problems where it's not clear that households with high return projects are the ones who are going to self-select for these loans.
I agree, but also I thought I saw 61% had some financing, maybe from family and friends.
Those are zero interest. Oftentimes, though, you can't get production loans from friends and relatives.
Are they zero interest?
Almost all of them.
Okay. In that case, I don't know. All right.
Maybe we should stop. So let me just stop there.
Thank you. Yeah. Unfortunately, the time is
Вот справа мониторе.
It's in that folder. You have to click a few folders.
Правый нижний угол.
This one.
randomized experiments to natural experiments from history. I'm doing economic development and political economy analysis and application to the Russian economic history, and I would like to take this opportunity to present, broadly speaking, the agenda, the research agenda in this field, and to concentrate more on a paper which has clear parallels with Chinese development experience. So first, let me start with why these topics are interesting for economists and people in finance who might be interested. The first point is that there are a lot of quasi-natural experiments and unique institutions in the Russian and Soviet past, and specifically in the 20th century. On top of that, there are tremendous amount of data, and this is unfortunate that many economists actually don't realize how good Russian and Soviet historical data are. This happened because of long tradition of collecting statistics in this country since the middle of the 19th century. Basically, we got our central statistical agency more or less at the same time as the UK, France, Germany, and so on. And this agency followed exactly the same procedures, and in the end, highly good in quality data are available for relatively very poor countries. Russia is not very wealthy nowadays, and it was much less wealthy in the past, and this, I think, the uniqueness of this experience from the point of view of economic and financial analysis. Here I provide several links to the websites where these Russian data are available nowadays, and let me concentrate on the first one because this is what I've done myself. And this is the resource which is supported by the new economic school, obviously, because I was the leader of the project, one of the leaders of the project which collected this data. But there are also others where you could find Russian historical statistics. And taking all that, you could address, hopefully causally, in a causal sense, interesting questions from economic and economic point of view. Let me provide some examples of these exercises. Then economic historians and economists ask make research on historical data. I use my own papers because we are talking about Russia and Soviet Union. Just several examples. Forced labor, and so in the Russian context, this is serfdom. So basically, we still don't know how efficient or inefficient this system was. Theoretical argument could go both ways. So what empirics says tells us, again, the results are also, evidence are mixed. Fogel, who got Nobel Prize in economics, argued that forced labor, slavery in the US was equally productive as free labor in the US as well. In this paper, we address this question in application to 19th century to Russian development in the 19th century, and we find the opposite results. We find that the abolition of serfdom contributed a lot to economic development and speed up economic growth. I'm not going to concentrate on this paper right now, so sorry. If you want, you could go to the website and download the paper. It's on the review of American, it's on the revised and the submit study in the American Economic Review, so it's now 100 pages long because they required us a lot of work. In terms of other papers, let me mention, in terms of other interesting phenomena, let me mention commune and communal landing. And this research has clear parallels to what we have just heard from the previous speaker about development in rural areas. And in particular, your conjecture was that it was migration which basically was the mechanism for the result, which secured the result you find. I should say that I'm ready to buy your results because of this paper. This paper shows that better property rights in land contributed to within-country migration in the early 19th century Russia. There was a reform, then peasants could privatize their land, and participation of this reform contributed to within-country migration and better allocation, better and more efficient allocation of labor across the Russian Empire. Today I would like to concentrate on this paper, which is on command economy and hierarchical structures. Why? Because this paper, while it is published several years ago, I apologize for that I'm not bringing my most recent research to your attention. But why I choose this paper is because, okay, it has clear parallels with Chinese experience, and in this, it's easy for me to do this that way. So let me start with one of the explanations of Chinese development success over the recent 2 decades, which would sound as the following. The central government provided high-power incentives to the regional leaders, first of all, to provincial governors, and secured a kind of yardstick competition between them when the promotion and demotion of provincial leaders in China depended on the economic achievements of their regions. There are several papers which show that indeed there is such correlation between careers of regional leaders in China and economic growth of the regions in charge of which they were or they are. And this yardstick competition between the leaders arguably is one of the reasons of Chinese success. And this is what called so-called M-form hierarchy, multi-division hierarchy, hierarchical structure, which Chinese governments, which Chinese government employed. There is a broader literature, a theory one, with big names among the authors, who analyzes from the theoretical side relative advantages of M-form hierarchy in comparison with so-called U-form, uniform hierarchy. Here I present very schematically the 2 types of hierarchies. M-form, this is U-form, and the idea of theoretical analysis why M-form is better, at least in terms of incentives, is that you can compare, when you organize the production this way, so there are some divisions, and there is industrial, each of which composed of several industries, and responsible of several industries, so think several regions. You can compare the regional results with each other. When you do this way, you basically have one division. You can't compare industries with each other because metallurgy is different than textile. So industry-specific shocks might be are likely not correlated, and because of that, you could organize competition between these guys, but it is very difficult to organize competition between these guys. So this is a kind of intuition behind this theory, and the motivation for this theoretical literature used to be China versus Soviet Union. China with M-form hierarchy and Soviet Union with U-form hierarchy. I said all that, I think. But the question is whether, so one lesson which would be learned from this theoretical literature is that you need to employ M-form hierarchy, and this is the way to success. And the relative history of two countries is in line with this prediction. For 10 minutes. Thank you. But the question is, what if divisions, these regional divisions, are not that uniform, or if they are poorly diversified and interconnected? In this case, you might have various outcomes. And in particular, negative effect, then you might get a negative effect of yardstick competition on outcomes because of the following logic. If regions are poorly diversified and interconnected, then instead of do your best, you could do bad to your neighbor. So this is relative competition, not absolute competition. And Chinese literature, actually Su, who is, my understanding, who is the head of business school in Beijing, right?
No,
No.
Xu Chenggang,
Okay.
the other guy, Chen Yingyi, is
Yeah.
the Tsinghua dean.
I apologize for that. Yeah, okay. So anyway, there is a conjecture that the specific feature of China is that regions are big and well diversified and not well, and because of that they are not that much dependent on each other. So the competition between them is feasible. So the paper about which I'm talking right now actually explores this conjecture in application to the Soviet Union. It is true that the Soviet Union, and in particular we are looking at one particular reform which happened in this period of time, late 50s, early 60s, so-called Совнархоза reform, which replaced Soviet U-form hierarchy by M-form hierarchy for a short period of time. So it's true that in the Soviet Union there used to be U-form hierarchy, but there was a short period under Khrushchev leadership. Then there was M-form hierarchy. Khrushchev abolished industrial ministers and replaced them with local authorities, so-called Совнархозы, this is the term, which were responsible for industrial development. Okay, I will skip that, all historical details, and go immediately to data. So we constructed a data set which covers all Russian regions, about 100, so compare 100 Russian regions with 30 regions in China, and Russia is smaller than China. So Russian regions are much smaller than Chinese ones, and this is important in terms of diversification and interconnections of the regions. So Russians, at least once we're looking at size, there is a clear difference between two structures in two countries. So our data set covers 17 years. This is, we got data about all leaders and their career paths during these years. So we have about about 6% of demotions and 5% of promotions in this period. So a unit of observation is a region in a year, and what happened to both to the economic development of this region in this year and to the leader of this region, party secretary. So we estimate simple regression, where on the left-hand side we have the career of the leader in a particular region in a particular year, and we are mainly interested mainly interested in the reform period. So whether the industrial growth during the reform period was positively or negatively, positively correlated with career paths during the reform years. And this is what we indeed find. Industrial growth itself didn't of a region didn't affect career paths of the leaders outside, if you consider the whole period under study, but if you consider the period of the reform, we find positive and significant effect. This is consistent with the literature which claims that M-form hierarchies provide high power incentives to the leaders. If you think about sub-narcosis system as a M-form hierarchy, we find exactly the same what our part of the literature finds in respect to China. The problem, however, is that the Soviet Union didn't start growing faster in this period, first, and second, the system was eventually abolished. The question is why? What went wrong? We have incentives during the sub-narcotic period, but we don't see growth. To investigate that, we explore the hypothesis that it is diversification of the region which mattered. We estimate Herfindahl index for each region of the Soviet Union before the reform based on occupational structure in the region, and we interact this measure with the reform, and we find that if a region was diversified enough, there was faster growth. So the contribution of this paper on top of the findings which already existed and were based on Chinese experience, this is our main contribution in this paper. Not only M-form matters, but the size of the region, diversification of the region, or diversity, and we will talk about diversity, I think, in 10 minutes, right?
In two.
In two minutes. No, I will not want additional in 3 minutes. In 3 minutes. This is what matters. Okay, once I have 3 minutes, I can speak a bit more about what could decrease this potential negative effect of diversification, of poor diversification. And we find that this is networks, social networks. We have a measure which is of involvement of the leaders into social networks, namely whether Soviet leaders went to so-called party school in Moscow. There was a special school for regional leaders there which we could attend. Some of them indeed attended once they were already in advanced stages of their careers. We don't think that this is a measure of human capital, because they learn quite specific things in that school. So we mainly view this as a measure of social capital and basically knowing each other. It's like something in the business schools nowadays are all about that. So we take this measure and interact it with diversification reform period and attending or not attending higher party school. And they find that effect of diversification mattered only for for those who attended party school, but not for non-attendants, for those who didn't attend party school, but not for those who attended. So if you knew your neighbors, you could coordinate with them and overcome this and overcome this potential negative effect of poor diversification. So let me sum up with these examples. I hope I persuaded you that history of this part of the world has a lot of useful economics, and we could learn many interesting things from that.
Okay, so 15 minutes. All right, so I'll do, on that time I do the following. I will present the 5 minutes version of what I want to say, and then I present the second version, which will be 10 minutes, so 15 minutes. Let me have a review. So what is the story I want to tell you a little bit? So Andrei already mentioned, President Andrei mentioned diversity measures and all these things. So what we are we're interested in diversity. Look at what this group here have. They're different on many dimensions, right? Age, gender, education, some other things. So basically, those characteristics we are different. And therefore we introduce the notion of diversity. Informally everybody knows what it is. Formally it's a little bit more difficult. So what we do is the following. I will a little skip the notion of diversity, but I say the following. Let's recognize that diversity is there. Now what we do is we try to measure diversity. So if you measure diversity, so you get some numbers, you get indices. About a little bit about it. But suppose we somehow measure the diversity or some other mathematics, empirical, and then after you got the indices of diversity, the question which is asked in this brand of literature is, is it possible that indices explain something? Economic growth, economic development, corruption, quality of institutions, all the economic and social outcomes. So the outcomes, let's say economic outcomes. So for the last 20 years, the focus was here, and I will not talk about this today. I'll talk about history, diversity, and the measurement of diversity. And once again, this is a 5 minutes version, so how do we measure? So roughly speaking, we do the following. We look at the attributes, which could be gender, no, 3 genders here, let's not talk genders, let's say languages or some other characteristics. Yeah? So we have characteristics, those are attributes. We'll talk about the languages, but it's interchangeable, because we do in languages. We have a lot of data in languages, we wrote a book on languages, so languages, of course, different languages. And then you have people, which belong to those groups. So what we have a set of attributes, set of languages, set of characteristics, and the distribution of population across these attributes. So I could have finished there, but I need a little explanation. So what it is about? Where are the difficulties here? There are quite a few difficulties. I'll talk about only 2 or 3 of them. First of all, how do we define the attributes? Let's say language. We immediately, Chinese actually is a good example. There are many different dialects. Is it the same language? It's not the same language. How many attributes we should have? Well, in Singapore they decided that it's only 1 Chinese dialect. In some other places it's different. But in many, for example, for European example, Serbian and Croatian, is it the same language? It's not the same language. So the issue of attributes is a complicated matter, but let's leave it aside for a moment. But then also about people. Sometimes it's difficult to identify people, or this identification with respect to attributes. Some people speak more than two languages, more than one language. Some people do this, that. Some people speak nothing, and you have still associated with something. So there's a lot of issues here. In addition to that, when I talk about the technical things here, but there is also a very important issue of association. How do people feel? Because I suppose I speak 3 languages, but I have association with this. How do I feel about this language, about that? So all of these things, subjective things, they come into equation here. So but basically what I'll tell you really in 10 minutes here, what's about the problems which arise as a result of this association, and how do we resolve this identification problem? Identification problem is quite difficult. So that's basically that's basically what it is, and so the story is I'll talk about languages. So okay, so outline is not important since I don't follow it. So there is a very wide range of diversity. So it's a linguistic one of those, it's religion, history, economics, history, what Andrei talked about, and some other things. Now, is diversity good or bad? Well, I cannot avoid bringing this quote of Thomas Aquinas, who said that the angel is more valuable than a stone. 2 angels are more valuable than 2 stones, right? But we don't know whether whether 2 angels are more valuable than 1 angel and 1 stone. So the issue of diversity is, so when we mix things, is it good or bad? So really, I don't have time to go there. It's my favorite topic of discussion here, what is good, what is bad. So let's not do that and go first. So measurement of diversity. That's already I mentioned. Actually, in terms of distribution of people across the book, across the different attributes, basically, if you talk about ethnicity, let's say, that's basically what you need to draw the ethnographic map of the world, really, if you want to do that. And the first and most successful was done in Moscow in '64, believe it or not, with all these political constraints and computers can imagine what kind of technique existed in so on. So in 1964, there was decided that we do this ethnographic map of the world. It has been done. Unbelievable. So it was done in one of the Institute of Academy of Science. For 50 years, it was really a leading data set until maybe not 50, 45 years. So it immediately was picked up in the West, and the publications basically they were dealing with this map which has been done in this Russian Institute. But so that I talked about Serbian and Croatian, where we do Hindi, how do we dialects and not, and it's really a very important thing, as I see, as I mentioned. Group association, as I mentioned, how do people associate ourselves with the group? There is a literature which is Akerlof and Cranton, identification and all these things, and there is Catalan, now Catalan, Catalanian identity. How do people feel about these things? So, well, that's a part of the much bigger paper and research. So, but anyway, we also did something on Sri Lanka in all this regard. But one of the things I really want to mention is that association of the people sometimes is a very strange thing. So we have a lot of research, like in the United States. Why do people use language, for example, this Afro-American dialect, AAVE, or New York Latino English, which people know in advance that if you speak this language when you're trying to get a job, your chances are lower. And the people still speak this language, it's a social pressure, it's identification because I want to be a certain person. But it's an unbelievably interesting part of literature, but we will not talk about it. I really want to say something about indices and the challenges. The most famous index that we use is the following. We take the probability here, take different groups, suppose we have different groups in society. What is the probability of 2 randomly chosen individuals belong to different groups? This is the most famous and oldest index of diversity here. It's actually Corrado-Gini did it 105 years ago, Italy. Yeah, and so this is the index which is mostly used in the literature. This is the index. This is where NI it's a proportional fraction of the group in the total population. And you can see this is the index which has been used in many different things. Now, this is index A. This is index E, which is a more famous even in other disciplines, in this entropy, Shannon entropy, which is a similar functional index. So we have a lot of these things, but important for me is the following. which is very important thing, so for me, obviously, what I do. So there is another more sophisticated index of diversity. If you remember this one, this is a square, right? Ni in squares. Here, what we have, it's alphas. Alpha is one very important thing, what we are saying. So you take this index 1 minus ni, sum of ni's power alpha, and the point here is, which is only very relevant today. Alpha is really basically indicates how the society estimates its own diversity. How do people feel about the strangers? So diversity, of course, what is done most of the time, we come with the index, apply this index, measure it, and then try to say something. But the diversity, in my view, and there is a lot of research on this field, so it's not really important what is objective notion of diversity. What's important for the society, the impact on different policies, is how do people feel in diversity. Well, let's say take United States, right? That's election, recently been election last year, and what happened here? In political science, they estimated a lot of places in Middle West. They voted on the basis of rejection of the immigrants and so intolerance of the people towards the others. I feel we don't want to talk about the state. Let's say somewhere in Wisconsin, if one family comes to the small town, it brings a lot of more diversity in the eyes of the people than it happens in Los Angeles, which is a very, very, very diverse place. So the questions really, what is very important, I just only started to enter this research, is it's not important what happened, what's really the index, but how the people feel about it. And this alpha is to be estimated empirically, and we do it in a different way. But what I'm trying to say here is alpha is a very important thing. There's a lot of research that diversity in Los Angeles, that's it. That's a sign. No. Too far, yeah. Okay. All right, so okay. So what happens is that there's a lot of discussion that diversity in Los Angeles is higher than diversity in Indianapolis, but it doesn't mean that the people feel it about the same way. So what I'm trying to say here is the following. And this is actually 2 points I want to make. There is no time. One is the following. I compare, let's say that's my European example, but Belgium. So we compare 2 countries, Andorra and Belgium. Andorra, you calculate the index A. Andorra is, Catalan now. Catalan in Spanish. In Andorra, it consists of 50% whose people claim the native language. Catalan and 50% claim the native language is Spanish. So you calculate index A, which we index A, and it's 1 minus sum of the squares. 1 minus 0.5 square, that's 0.5. If you go to Belgium, what happens in Belgium? They have 2 communities. Roughly speaking, it's 1640. 60% speak Flemish, like our friend, and 40% like a native language, and 40% roughly speaking speak French. So if you calculate this index for Belgium, you get 1 minus this expression, and the result is 48. So what happens here? What happens here is that Belgium turns out to be less diverse than Andorra, which is ridiculous to everybody who knows both countries. So what is the story here? And this is one of the points I want to make. This calculation disregards the differences, the proximity of the languages. In Andorra, Catalan and Spanish, they're close to each other, while Flemish and French, they are from different groups. So what we are saying here is that the proximity of these indices, which I just gave you, A, B, E, they don't take into account proximity of. So how close these attributes here to each other. This is a very important thing. And now what we have is the following. So what we do is we introduce the distances between the languages, and that's a separate industry, so which I don't want to bring you into that. But what we do is, it's very important, distances between attributes matter, and therefore, well, there are different tables. If somebody is interested, I can send you all of these things. We have a tens of the different tables. This is in European languages, what we distances between each other. So we have also Chinese and Asian languages and all these tables we have there. So we really don't have time to go to that, since I want to make a crucial point. The index which we really would like to use is the index B, which introduces the distances between the groups. DKI, it's the distance between group K and group I. That could be linguistic, it could be genetic, it could be anything you want. So B is the more general version of index A. So what we know about all this? We say that B is much better index than A. And so whatever research with many research applications, what we did is that it shows that the explanatory power of B is much stronger than A. So without going into, so the proximity between between groups definitely matters. And well, there's many stories there. We looked at the story of Sri Lanka, which is well, tragic story of linguistic conflict, and many different things. But that's what it is. So distances matter. That's one point. And another point with another index that we use, which we sometimes in trying to explain many different economic and political outcomes, if you look at distances not between all the regions matter. So sometimes we have a center and periphery. And so in calculating this index, you don't need to take the distances between peripheral regions, but you take distances only between the center and periphery. So it's another index that we use in our empirical work here. Now, so basically what I'm saying is here is the following. In order to overcome the proximity of these attributes, the distances are useful elements. So if you introduce the indices, you don't care really whether it's Serbian or Croatian. They're close to each other, so index somehow, distance takes care of this work. So we are much more relaxed when we use the index, which takes into account the distances which index without. So this is the thing, and that's empirics, which I don't have time to show you. Now, another family of the index, which I briefly mentioned, it's indexes which polarization. It's another industry which is flourishing these days, and polarization indices, which polarization changes. Polarization differs from the story in the following. Here you say you simply count people here and there. When you talk about polarization, you take also into account how do people feel about each other. How do you feel about other groups? Whether you identify with your own group and how strongly you are alienated towards other groups. So the feelings and the attitudes, they're part of this. So basically this picture is a very formal and technical picture if you want to talk about polarization indices, which is another growing thing. So you need to think about the attitude of people towards their own group. Sometimes it's a good question to ask, how do you feel about your own group, how do you feel about others? So it matters. Now, well, some other indices we introduced. So, but what I want to make a point, which is very not important, and the point is really important, much more important than anything, is the following. And I'll take 3 examples here. Sometimes, for 20 years what happened here is people invent different indices. I gave you 3 or 4 or 5. So people come, researchers. You say, you come in on the basis of this index, you would try to explain why China grows faster than Russia, than India, than some other countries. No, China indeed grows faster, but the question is, we come with our own indices, and then we try to force some kind of economic conclusions on those indices. So my point is like that. The problem which you deal with should really force you to choose the index that you are dealing with. And I will give you 3 examples. So it goes a different way. You look at the problem, you see what you want to achieve, and then you choose the index from the family which I offered. Now, one example would be enough, and some others also. For example, when people talk, if you remember still index A, let's say index A, people try to ask the following question. Does index A can explain the conflicts in the country? So how fractionalized does it really matter in order to explain the number of conflicts, the severity, intensity? And the answer was no. And the people for some time tried to force this index A on conflicts. The answer was more simpler. You don't need to take fractionalization, take polarization. How do people treat each other? How do we really identify with ourselves? How do we identify ourselves? How are we alienated towards others? That's what matters here. So this is the thing. Take the problem and go back to the index. And the second well, I don't talk about it. And the next example, it's a beautiful example, my friend Klaus Desmet. So with his friends, they did the following. They tried to look at different indices, and really it just didn't work out. So what they said the following. Depends what the problem you want to do. And there are two examples here. If you want, you look about different ethnic groups and all this, and you say, if you want to talk about something very basic, conflict between two communities which lasts 1,000 years, then you come back to this picture, and you say, you have a very rough, you need to have a very rough division of the society. You don't have to look at the dialect of Italian or this or that. So you need to really divide the community into languages, into groups, and so the partition should be much coarser than in the other cases. So if you want to deal with the basic problems, you don't deal with dialects. Forget about dialects. Look about very basic thing and do it in a different way. But if you want to talk about corruption, lobbying between the groups, so a relatively recent phenomena, then you really need to take a much finer division of the society in smaller groups. So once again, how you deal, what index you choose is the function of the question you ask. So that's basically the story. If somebody is interested, I would be happy to communicate with this, but at this point I want to thank everybody, our friends and colleagues from the distance, not actually so distant, but in Hong Kong, and thank you for coming. It was enjoyable, and I definitely believe it's not the last time, just the beginning, right, Albert?
Right.
Yeah, and we need to go.